all, even though the Rebbe was a big tzaddik, you have to be confident that he was on the level of Rav Akiva. So let's say you think he was, okay. The second thing is, if anyone who's gone to the aisle knows that you have to walk through a regular cemetery to get to him. Meaning you have to walk past regular people, non-tzadikim, to get to him, and non-tzadikim are for sure transmitting tumah. So therefore it's not relevant. But it would be relevant in Eretz Yisrael, where you have these Rameir Balanesses, its own building of just Rameir Balanes. Can Kohanim go? So according to this medrash, it seemed that it would be allowed. So what's the reason to disprove this medrash? So if you look at Taisus and Bab Metzia, Daf Kuf Yudalon Amabeis Divrei Amaschal Mahu, he writes the following. He says, first of all, he questions whether Eliyahu was actually a Kayin, and he says the following: we find that when Eliyahu Hanavi was burying Rav Akiva, he quieted Rav Yeshua Hagarsi, because what Eliyahu Hanavi said to Rav Yeshua Hagarsi, the reason why I'm allowed to touch Rav Akiva's body is because Rav Akiva is a tzaddik and tzaddikim don't transmit tumah. He says, it's not true what Eliyahu Hanavi said. What Eliyahu Hanavi said, that the reason why he's allowed to touch Rav Akiva because Rav Akiva is a tzaddik and tzaddikim don't transmit tumah, it's not true. Tzaddikim do transmit tumah. And the reason why he quieted Rav Yeshua Garsi is because out of respect for Rav Akiva, this is not the time to have a halachic discussion. So he just sort of quieted Rav Yeshua Garsi. It's like a lot of times if you have lahavdil, you have like parents who are discussing something important and the little kid comes in and asks a question and the parent doesn't have time to really answer him, so he's just sort of like whatever. He just says something to quiet him. Rav Yeshua Garsi says, Eliyahu, why are you touching Rav Akiva's body? I thought you were a Kayin. So Eliyahu wasn't really interested. He didn't have time to explain to him the halacha, so he just gave him an answer. And the answer was that tzaddikim don't transmit tumah. But it's not true. Tzaddikim do transmit tumah. So what was the reason why Eliyahu Navi was allowed to bury Rav Akiva and to touch Rav Akiva? Not because tzaddikim don't transmit tumah. Tzaddikim do transmit tumah. So what was the heter? The answer is very simple. Ikar time ahaya lefisha haya meis mitzvah lefisha yirayim lekavra shayim arugei malchus. Very simple. The explanation is, says Tais, is much more obvious. Tzaddikim do transmit tumah. There's no such thing as tzaddikim don't transmit tumah. Of course tzaddikim transmit tumah. So what's the heter? Why was Eliyahu Hanavi allowed to bury Rav Akiva? Very simple. The halacha is that a kayin is not allowed to contaminate. He's not allowed to bury people. But there is one he's allowed to bury. Certain family members he's allowed to contaminate himself to. But there is one type of person that he's allowed to contaminate himself for, and that's called a meis mitzvah. What does a meis mitzvah mean? A meis mitzvah is not very practical nowadays. Baruch Hashem, it's not very common. But the common case was you have a kayin, and he's in the middle of the desert, and he comes across a Jewish body, and there is no one around to bury this body. So because it's disrespectful to leave the body out, that body is called a meis mitzvah. He's a dead body and it's a mitzvah to bury him because there's no one around to bury him. Then a kayin is obligated to bury a person, because a kayin is allowed to contaminate in order to bury a meis mitzvah. So says Taisus, it's very simple. The same way a kayin is allowed to bury a meis mitzvah, Eliyahu Hanavi was a meis mitzvah. Think about the situation. Eliyahu Hanavi is dead, but where is he? He's in prison. No one is willing to walk in to this Roman prison and take Rav Akiva's body out, because I'm assuming if you tried to do that, you'd be killed. Therefore, the only person willing to bury Rav Akiva was Eliyahu Hanavi. So Rav Akiva was a meis mitzvah. Very simple. What's the difference between Rav Akiva's situation and finding a dead body in the desert? A Kohen is obligated to bury a meis mitzvah. Again, nowadays it's not relevant because it's very rare to have it that no other Jew can bury this person other than a Kohen. But conceptually, if a Kohen were to find the body and there's no one else to bury him, of course he's obligated. So that's exactly the situation with Rav Akiva. Rav Akiva was sitting in prison. No one is willing. Everyone's afraid to go in. No one's willing to take care of it. So Eliyahu says, fine, I'll do it. And he walked in. Not because tzaddikim don't transmit tumah. Of course they transmit tumah. The reason why he was allowed to bury him is because tzaddikim is because Rav Akiva had the status of a meis mitzvah. So says Taisvus, just to summarize, Taisvus says that what tzaddikim do transmit tumah. And when Eliyahu Hanavi said that they don't, when Eliyahu Hanavi said that tzaddikim don't transmit contamination, it wasn't true. He was just quieting Rav Yeshua Hagarsi. He was just answering him just to stop the conversation. But that wasn't the truth. Now you should know the Ramban in Yivamis doesn't like this Taisvus, because the Ramban in Yivamis says How could it be that how is it shaykh that Eliyahu Navi would say a halachic ruling that wasn't accurate? So okay, it's a point to be made, but right, because according to this, that means that Eliyahu Navi was saying Tzadikim don't transmit Tumah, even though they do, and he's just saying something completely incorrect just to quiet someone. That's obviously not allowed. From a halachic perspective, a Rav is not allowed to paskin incorrectly on purpose for what any reason. There's a famous Yam Shel Shloimeh that says that it gets the death penalty for such a thing, because if a Rav gets up and says in shul, oh, you don't have to keep Shabbos today, or it's okay, people smoke on Shabbos, it's fine, you could smoke on Shabbos. For a Rav to do that, he's tampering now with the genuine aspects of the Torah. He's questioning the Masorah of the Torah. To do such a thing, to paskin incorrectly on purpose, is obviously not allowed. It's forbidden. So therefore it is questionable as to how Eliyahu Navi was allowed to do this, because again, according to Taisus, Eliyahu Navi was carrying Rav Akiva's body because he was a meis mitzvah. Yet when Rav Yeshua Agarsi asked him why he was doing this, he said because tzaddikim don't transmit tumah, even though they do. So, okay, that's a point on Taisus. But Taisus, the point is the medrash, the source of the heter to allow Kohanim to go to the graves of a tzaddik was this medrash that said that Eliyahu Navi said that you're allowed to because tzaddikim don't transmit tumah. Taisus says that's not true. That wasn't the truth. So that's the first way to throw out the medrash. The second way is the eshkol. If you look at the eshkol, one of the Rishonim in Chilik Beis Daf Kuf Ayin Hey, he says very simple. Uda Amr b'medrash Eliyahu Rav Akiva ein tumah b'talmidei chachamim. This medrash where Eliyahu Navi said to Rav Akiva that tzaddikim do not transmit tumah, which again would be the source to allow Kohanim to go to the graves of tzaddikim, ein soimchen al halacha shebemidrashim im loy nirish and iskabel b'aliyat talmud. We don't paskin like midrashim. If the Gemara seems to indicate other than the medrash, we don't paskin like the medrash. Meaning, this is a medrash. So normally you can go with midrashim sometimes, but if there are Gemaras that seem to indicate otherwise, if our Gemara, Talmud Bavli, again, what's a medrash? Medrash is the same authors of the Mishnayos. Instead of writing halacha, they're writing their pirush on Chumash, or their pirush on Tanakh. So, says Eshkol, the halachas that are found in midrashim, it's not necessarily clear whether we rule that way. So if the Gemara seems to agree with it, then we'll go with the halacha. But if the Gemara seems to disagree, then we don't go. Meaning, the Eshkol is saying that this halacha that the Medrash says, take the Medrash for face value, that Eliyahu Navi was saying that you can touch Rav Akiva's body, and tzaddikim and Kohanim today can go to davener Rav Akiva, because Rav Akiva's body does not transmit tumah, because he's a tzaddik, even though that's a Medrash, says the Eshkol, our Gemara doesn't hold like that. Talmud Bavli doesn't agree with that. So where in Talmud Bavli does it not agree with this? He doesn't give us a source. He just says Talmud Bavli doesn't agree with us. You have to be a big Talmud Chacham to try to figure this out. Where in Talmud Bavli does it seem to indicate that tzaddikim do transmit tumah? The Medrash seems to allow it. Says the Eshkol, yeah, but our Gemara disagrees. Where? So there are two Gemaras. There are a couple Gemaras. First of all, there's a Gemara in Baba Basra. We'll get to it later, but I'll just tell you outside what the Gemara in Baba Basra says. The Gemara in Baba Basra says that Rav Benah, one of the Amirayim, was going around marking graves, and he eventually marked the Maras HaMachpelah. He says, here's Avraham, here's the Maras HaMachpelah. So the Rashbam and the Rishonim understand that what Rav Benah was doing, why he was indicating that there's Maras HaMachpelah is here, who cares where the Maras HaMachpelah is? So the Rishonim explained he was doing this so that Kohanim don't stumble on the Maras HaMachpelah, because Maras HaMachpelah has dead bodies, and the Kohen is not allowed to enter Maras HaMachpelah. Now, Maras HaMachpelah is the grave of Abraham, Sarah, Yitzchak. These are the greatest tzaddikim of all time. Yet the Rishonim clearly say, according to this Gemara, that Rav Benah indicated that here is the Maras HaMachpelah, meaning Kohanim do not enter here. So clearly, our Gemara in Baba Basra Daf Nun Ches does indicate that tzaddikim do transmit tumah. We'll get to that in a moment. But there's really a Gemara in Sukkah. I think the major one is a Gemara in Sukkah. The Gemara in Sukkah, Daf Chafei Beis, describes the... again, I'm trying to find the source from Talmud Bavli, from our Gemara, that seems to indicate that tzaddikim do transmit tumah, and that if someone touches the dead body of a tzaddik, he is tameh now. He is contaminated. So the Gemara in Sukkah, I think, is a pretty clear source for it. The Gemara in Sukkah tells us the concept of Pesach Sheni. What's Pesach Sheni? Pesach Sheni is that there were a group of Jews in the desert who were contaminated. They were tameh, and therefore they were not able to bring the Karban Pesach. So Moshe Rabbeinu said, there's a thing called the Pesach Sheni, which is a month later you'll bring the Karban Pesach then. So the Gemara in Sukkah wants to know, how are these people tameh? Like, how did these people get so tameh all of a sudden that they can't bring the Karban Pesach? What was going on in the desert that made them tameh? So the Gemara in Sukkah, Daf Chafayim Abay, says the following: there were people that were contaminated, they were tameh in the desert. How did these people become tameh? Says the Gemara. Noisei aroinoi shel Yosef hayu. Divrei Rav Yossi Haglili. Rav Yossi Haglili says, you know who these people were? These were the Jews who were carrying the bones of Yosef HaTzadik. And because they were carrying the bones of Yosef HaTzadik, they became tameh. And therefore they couldn't bring the Karban Pesach, they had to come on to a Pesach Sheni. Now let me ask you a question. Who were they carrying again? Yosef HaTzadik. They call him Yosef HaTzadik. Yet they were tameh. So clearly our Gemara tells us that the bones of Tzadikim do transmit Tumah, because the people who touched the bones of Yosef HaTzadik became tameh. That seems to be clear, seems to be pashut. So that's possibly where the Eshkol is coming from. The Eshkol says, although the Medrash does say that Eliyahu Hanavi said Tzadikim do not transmit Tumah, but our Gemara seems to disagree, because our Gemara in Sukkah tells us that the people who carried Yosef HaTzadik's bones became tameh. So clearly Tzadikim do transmit Tumah. Okay, so it seems to be a machlokes between the Medrash and our Gemara, and says the Eshkol, when there's a machlokes, we go with the Gemara. If there's a machlokes between a Medrash and a Gemara, we go with the Gemara. Very simple. There is a fascinating Avnei Nezer. The Avnei Nezer, the Sachar Travagain, in Yeridea Siman Tov Yud Zayin, he has a very lengthy discussion about this topic. And in Sifkat Yud Zayin, he writes the following. It's fascinating. He says like this: Li hayanir lahashvos. I want to make everything work. Why? What's the problem? Says the Avnei Nezer, we have a problem. Our Gemara tells us that the people who touched Yosef HaTzadik's bones became tameh. So clearly Tzadikim do make people tameh. One. But our Medrash says that Eliyahu Hanavi touched Rav Akiva, because Rav Akiva did not transmit Tumah. So Rav Akiva did not transmit Tumah, but Yosef HaTzadik did. So I said before, it's a machlokas, it's an argument. There's no way to make it work. There's an argument. Says the Avnei Nezer, I got a way to make it work. And that is the following. Dehine. Let me explain, says the Avnei Nezer. Tam tumas meis. What's the source of impurity? Why is it that a person who's dead transmits tumah? What is it about a dead body that transmits tumah? So right off the simple explanation would be, it doesn't have a neshama, right? It's a lifeless body. The neshama left it, and therefore things without a neshama transmit tumah. But that's not true, because cows don't have a neshama. You kill a cow, it doesn't transmit tumah, right? Animals don't have neshamas like we do, and we don't become contaminated by touching it. So what is it about a dead body that when HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when the body dies, all of a sudden he was pure, and now everything's tameh? What changed? So he says, Kasav Ramban. The Ramban explains. You know why? Mishum the Adam meis beityo shel nachash. Kamasha Kasav Rav Chaim Vital. The Rav Chaim Vital explains. Shagimel tipe mara shazorik malach hamaves metamim haguf. Ve'ena moitzas haneshama manoyach lekaf ragla v'yoytza umikan tumas mes. An unbelievable teaching of the Ramban and it's Rav Chaim Vital and his other Rishonim. The Gemara tells us, it's in a couple Gemaras, that when a person dies, the Malach HaMavis comes and he has a sword. And on that sword, and he doesn't kill the person by chopping off his head, he takes this sword, and the Gemara tells us that on the tip of his sword he has poison. And he drips the poison into the mouth of the person, and that's how they die. That's what the Gemara says. So you read the Gemara, it's very odd. What do you mean? Every person dies from poison. So you take a forensic test, you won't see the poison. So what does it mean? So says Reb Chaim Vital, you know what it means? What the Malach HaMavis is doing, how does the Malach HaMavis kill someone? How do you kill a Jew? You take the neshama out. How do you remove the neshama of a Jew? Do you know what the Malach HaMavis does? He has his sword. And on the tip of his sword he has a poison. That poison is not an actual physical poison. It means tumah. He has contamination. And he drips tumah into the body. And the tumah and the neshama are now fighting. And the neshama is so repulsed by the amount of tumah that's now in the body that the neshama leaves. That's what goes on. Unbelievable thing. Tumah enters the body. And the neshama is so disgusted, so revolted. He says, "Ain like, what's the lashon? Ain maitzes haneshama menoyach lekaf ragla." The neshama can't stay there anymore, so the neshama leaves. That's the source of tumah. The source of tumah is not the removal of a neshama; it's how the neshama is removed. The source of tumah is the interaction with the Malach HaMavis. That's what the Rishonim say. So says the Avnei Nezer Ach Zeh B'meis, that's only if a person interacted with the Malach HaMavis. That's only if you die naturally. When someone dies naturally, he was killed by the Malach HaMavis. But says the Avnei Nezer Ach B'nerag She'enoi Meis Aidei Malach HaMavis. I don't understand this 100%, but I'll tell you what he says. The Zohar writes in the parsha of Egla Arufa that when someone is murdered, when a Jew is murdered, he is not killed by the Malach HaMavis. He's not killed by the Malach HaMavis. In that situation, he's killed by the other Jew. So, or the other person. I don't want to say other Jew. He's killed by the murderer. The murderer killed this person, not the Malach HaMavis. That's what the Zohar says. Now, how this makes sense and how this all works, I'm not 100% sure, but we're going to trust the Zohar because he was the doctor for the soul. So we're going to believe the Zohar when it comes to these things. So the Zohar says that it's possible to die not through the interaction with the Malach HaMavis. If someone's murdered, the Malach HaMavis didn't take him. He says that's why there was a ceremony of the Egla Arufa. The ceremony of the Egla Arufa is if you find a dead body, you chop a baby calf, and the blood spills, and that's the whole process. There's a whole process in Kiseitze. So the Zohar says the reason for that process is because when someone's murdered and he's not killed by the Malach HaMavis, there's a system problem in Shemayim. Because now it's sort of like, you go up to Shemayim and they're not ready for you, lahavdil. Chalila, because they weren't killed by the Malach HaMavis. So that Egla Arufa somehow fixes it. But the point is, says the Zohar, if someone's murdered, he wasn't killed by the Malach HaMavis. He wasn't killed by the Malach HaMavis. And therefore, go the next step, he doesn't have tumah. Meaning, what the Zohar is, according to the Zohar, says the Avnei Nezer, the only source of tumah is in the interaction with the Malach HaMavis. Someone who's murdered does not interact with the Malach HaMavis and hence does not have tumah. Therefore, he says everything works out perfectly. It's beautiful. This is what he says. Val Karchach Dafka Rav Akiva shenerag b'dei Adam hu shamer Yoshe into Tzadikim. Aval Yosef shemeis mi'atzmai shaper kama gemar noisei arena shel Yosef hayu. Meaning it works out. What was the Avnei Nezer's problem? The Avnei Nezer's problem is that there's a contradiction. The Gemara in Sukkah tells us that people who touch Yosef HaTzadik's bones became tamei. So clearly Tzadikim do transmit tumah. But then there's the Medrash that says that Eliyahu Navi carried Rav Akiva's body because he says he's a tzaddik, he doesn't transmit tumah. So Yosef did, Rav Akiva didn't. What's the difference? So says Avnei Nezer, I'll tell you the difference. Rav Akiva was murdered. People who are murdered do not transmit tumah. Yosef HaTzadik died naturally. Therefore, he interacted with the Malach HaMavis, and therefore he does transmit tumah. So according to Avnei Nezer, it depends. Not all tzaddikim transmit tumah. Not all people transmit tumah. If you were murdered, if someone was murdered, then they do not transmit tumah because they were never killed by the Malach HaMavis. So far we have the Medrash, which seems to imply that all tzaddikim are pure and they don't transmit tumah. Then we have our Gemaras and Taisvis and the Eshkol, which says no, all people transmit tumah, even tzaddikim. And then you have the Avnei Nezer's approach, which is it depends how they died. He says tumah stems from the interaction with the Malach HaMavis. If the person interacted with the Malach HaMavis, then he transmits tumah. If he didn't interact with the Malach HaMavis, then he doesn't transmit tumah. So Rav Akiva, who was murdered, wasn't killed by the Malcham Avis, therefore there's no tumah. Rav Yosef Tzaddik was killed naturally, he died naturally, therefore he was killed by the Malcham Avis, and therefore there is tumah. This is all surrounding the Medrash. There's a second potential source to allow it, and that's the Gemara in Ksubis. The Gemara in Ksubis is Daf Kuf Gimel Amid Beis. The Gemara says the following: Oisai Hayayim Shemeis Rebbe, the day that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi died, Batla Kedusha. Kedusha ended in the world. The day that he died, there was no more holiness. What does that mean? It sounds very bleak. It sounds like, like the Rabbanim back then, they were holy, and not anymore. It sounds like there's no more holiness nowadays. What does this mean? So the Rishonim explain what it means is that on that day there was no more holiness of Kohanim. Meaning that all Kohanim went to the grave, went to the burial of Rav Yehuda Nasi. They all went to his levaya, they all went to his funeral. So what the Gemara means is the day that Rav Yehuda Nasi died, there was no more holiness, because all the Kohanim went to his funeral. And look what Tosah says. Tosah says the following: Rav Chaim Kohen. Rav Chaim Kohen says, he used to say, Ilmalei hayisi kishenifter Rabbeinu Tam. Rav Chaim Kohen was one of the Balei Taisasim, and he says, if I was alive, he was a Kohen, obviously, as his name indicates. He says, if I was alive when Rabbeinu Tam died, hayisi mitamela, I would go to his funeral, even though I'm a Kohen and he was, I'm a Kohen. Why? The Haibatla Kedusha the Kamaracha, because when the Gemara says that all the Kohanim went to the funeral of Rav Yehuda Nasi, Hainu Kedusha's Kahuna. It means that all the Kohanim went to the funeral of Rabbi. Fine. The point is, what we have from this Gemara is this Gemara tells us that the day that Rav Yehuda Nasi died, there was no more holiness, meaning that Kohanim were going to his grave, and Rav Chaim Kohen said, not only Rav Yehuda Nasi, I would have gone to Rabbeinu Tam's funeral had I been there. What's the reason why they went to Rav Yehuda Nasi's funeral? Why is everyone going to Rav Yehuda Nasi's grave? Doesn't make any sense. Why was it that the day that Rav Yehuda Nasi died, there was no more holiness, meaning everyone went to his funeral, everyone went to his grave? Why? So some Rabbanim say this is yet another source that Tzadikim do not transmit Tumah. Meaning, Rav Yehuda Nasi was a very big Tzadik, and all the Kohanim were allowed to go to his grave. So clearly, Tzadikim do not transmit Tumah. So this is the second source to allow Kohanim to go to graves of Tzadikim, because Kohanim went to the grave of Rav Yehuda Nasi. Clearly, Tzadikim do not transmit Tumah. Yet, once again, this proof is not very strong. The Beis Yosef already throws this out in Siman Shin Ayin Daled. And Rav Avadia deals with this. Rav Avadia Zatzal in Yichav Das Chelik Daled Siman Nun Ches deals with this. The answer to this, even this proof, again, what's the proof? The Gemara says that the day that Rav Yehuda Nasi died, all the Kohanim went to his funeral and went to his grave. So clearly they went to his grave because he's a tzaddik, and tzaddikim don't transmit tumah. It's not true. Let me read you some of the words of the Beis Yosef. And Ravadi deals with this. Let me explain. What this means is, the reason why Kohanim were allowed to go and partake in the funeral of Rav Yehuda Nasi was not as some Rabbanim thought. Right? What did some Rabbanim think? Some Rabbanim thought because Rav Yehuda Nasi was a tzaddik, therefore you're allowed to go to the grave. You're allowed to go because he's a tzaddik. He doesn't transmit tumah. So not only were you allowed to go at that time, you'd be allowed to go always. You'd perpetually be allowed to go to Rav Yehuda Nasi's grave. Lo'olam v'od. You'd be constantly, every day, you can go down to Rav Yehuda Nasi's grave because he's a tzaddik. It's not true. That was a special heter to go to the funeral of Rav Yehuda Nasi, and only Rav Yehuda Nasi. Why? I said before, what is the one exception that a Kohen is allowed to go? A Kohen is allowed to help bury a mace mitzvah. What is a mace mitzvah? A mace mitzvah is, you have a Jew that's found alone, no one's there to bury him, it's disgraceful for a Jewish body to be left out without anyone taking care of it. Therefore, a Kohen is obligated to bury him. So what's the definition of Meis Mitzvah? So you'd say, it means there's no one. Right? No one. Literally, there's no one around, so the Kohen is the only one guy. You know what we see from this Gemara? We see from this Gemara that it doesn't have to be that he's the only one guy. Rav Yehuda Nasi was so great. The Nasi of Klal Yisrael, the Prince of Klal Yisrael, he was so great that when he died, every member of Klal Yisrael had to go to his funeral. And if members of Klal Yisrael didn't go, it would be disgraceful. The same way it's disgraceful for a body to be left out alone without anyone taking care of it, if Rav Yehuda Nasi did not get every member of Klal Yisrael at his funeral, it would be just as disgraceful. So the reason why Kohanim were allowed to go to the funeral of Rav Yehuda Nasi was not because he's a tzaddik and tzaddikim don't transmit tumah. And it doesn't mean that they can go to Rav Yehuda Nasi's grave to daven. It was a one-time deal. They were allowed to go to his funeral and partake in his funeral and send him out of this world with respect. Why? Because he was Rav Yehuda Nasi. Because when a Nasi dies, every member of Klal Yisrael has to go to show respect to the Nasi, and if they don't, it's just as disrespectful as having a Jew left out alone without anyone to bury him. Meaning it's the equivalent of a regular Jew not being buried is equally disgraceful as Rav Yehuda Nasi having 99% of Klal Yisrael come to his funeral and not 100%. He deserves every person. And if the Kohanim were to not go to his funeral, it would be disrespectful. Therefore, they were allowed to go because he was a Meis Mitzvah. A Meis Mitzvah means a Jew that does not have proper respect. So generally that means no one's there to bury him. Rav Yehuda Nasi's case, he had hundreds of thousands of people, but because he deserved everyone, if they didn't go, it would be disrespectful, and therefore they were allowed to go. So says the Beis Yosef, first of all, it was a heter for Rav Yehuda Nasi, because he was the Nasi. Second of all, it wasn't because tzaddikim don't transmit tumah. Tzaddikim do transmit tumah, but they were allowed to go because he was a Meis Mitzvah. And third, they were only allowed to go for his funeral. They were not allowed to daven at him perpetually. And on that, Rav Chaim Kayin, the author of that Taisvis, said, not only is it Rav Yehuda Nasi, it's any leader of Klal Yisrael deserves every member of Klal Yisrael at his funeral, and therefore I would have gone to Rabbeinu Tam. Again, for the same reason, because Rabbeinu Tam deserves everyone, because he was the leader of Klal Yisrael at the time. And if I don't go, says Rav Chaim Kayin, if I don't go to his funeral, and I stay out, it's disrespectful. And therefore he's considered a Meis Mitzvah. So yet again, this is a way to throw out this Gemara. So when the Gemara says that the Kohanim went to the funeral of Rav Yehuda Nasi, it doesn't mean, as the simple explanation is, that Rav Yehuda Nasi's body didn't transmit tumah. His body did transmit tumah. The reason why they were allowed to go is because he deserved everyone. It was for his funeral, and he was considered a Meis Mitzvah, which is like a crazy thing to say that Rav Yehuda Nasi was considered a Meis Mitzvah, because, again, that's what a Meis Mitzvah is. A Jew who's not getting enough respect. Every member of Klal Yisrael had to go to his funeral, and if they didn't, it wouldn't be respectful. There's a second way to throw out this medrash, and it's at this Gemara, and it's a similar approach of the Avnei Nezer. Rabbeinu Bachai in Sefer Kara Kemach, Milos Ahava, he was bothered by this Gemara. Again, because the issue of this Gemara is the same. The basic halacha is that Kohanim are not allowed to go to the graves of tzaddikim. Yet this Gemara says that they went to Rav Yehuda Nasi's kever. They buried Rav Yehuda Nasi. So it seems that Rav Yehuda Nasi didn't transmit tumah. So again, we had our own understanding. Beis Yosef had his understanding. But the simple explanation of the Gemara is that Rav Yehuda Nasi did not transmit tumah. But why? Says the Kara Kemach. I thought tzaddikim do transmit tumah. So what's special about Rav Yehuda Nasi? You know what the answer is? He says the following: V'zayis ha'isa madrega Moshe Rabbeinu over l'shalom sha'isa misase b'neshika. Shegein darshu Chazal, how did Moshe Rabbeinu die? The Gemara tells us that Moshe Rabbeinu was so special that he didn't die through the Malach HaMavis, he died through Hashem kissing him. V'yamash Moshe eved Hashem ba'aretz mayev al pi Hashem melamed shemeis b'neshika. Meaning that Moshe Rabbeinu was so holy that he didn't die through the Malach HaMavis' interaction. And as we explained before, how does the Malach HaMavis kill a Jew? He drops tumah into his body, which forces the neshama out. It's a very traumatic experience. And Moshe Rabbeinu was too holy for that. His body was too holy that Hashem wouldn't put tumah into his body. Therefore, how did he die? He died through Hashem kissing him. Hashem kissed him and gently removed the neshama. So says the Rabbeinu Bachai, V'zu haisa misasai shel Rabbeinu HaKadosh. That's also how Rav Yehuda Nasi died. How do I know this? How does he know that that's like a good trivia question? How did Rav Yehuda Nasi die? Says Rabbeinu Bachai, he died through the Misa Neshika. He was kissed by Hashem. How does he know that? There's no Gemara that says that. You know how he knows it? From our Gemara. And that's why the Gemara Ksubas says Mishameis Rabbi Batla Kedusha. And that's why the Gemara says that the day that Rav Yehuda Nasi died, all the Kohanim went to his grave. Even the Kohanim went. Why? Because he didn't die through the interaction with the Malach HaMavis. He died through Hashem. We explained before from the Avnei Nezer. The Avnei Nezer says from the Rishonim, where is the source of Tumah on a body? The source of Tumah on a body is the interaction with the Malach HaMavis. So the Avnei Nezer said, if I were to find you a person that was not killed through the Malach HaMavis, he would have no Tumah. So the Avnei Nezer's case was someone who was murdered. A much more simple case. And even Avnei Nezer mentioned this. And that's what the Rabbeinu Bachai says. Someone who was killed by Hashem. Someone who died through Misas Neshika. Someone who died not through the Malach HaMavis, through Hashem kissing him. Such a person does not transmit Tumah. So he says, Rav Yehuda Nasi died that way. Rav Yehuda Nasi was not killed by the Malach HaMavis. He was killed by Hashem. How do I know this? Where's the source for this? He says, our Gemara in Ksubas. Because the simple explanation of our Gemara in Ksubas is that the day that Rav Yehuda Nasi died, all the Kohanim went to his funeral. Why? So Rav Beis Yosef said because of Meis Mitzvah. Says Rabbeinu Bachai, I'll give you a simple explanation. There was no Tumah transmitted by Rav Yehuda Nasi. Why not? Because he died through Neshika. He was not killed by the Malach HaMavis. He died through Hashem kissing him directly. And therefore, Kohanim would be allowed to go to his grave even today. So what we have is, once again, you have the Medrash which seems to imply all Tzadikim don't transmit Tumah, the Gemara which seems to imply all Tzadikim do transmit Tumah, and now you have the Avnei Nezer and the Rabbeinu Bachai, and that says it depends. If you died through the Malach HaMavis, which is most people, then you do transmit Tumah. If you died through someone was murdered, or through Misas Neshika, which is extremely rare, then there would be no Tumah. So I just want to mention one more thing, that Gemara in Baba Basra, which implies that Tzadikim do transmit Tumah. Let me read it again. The Gemara in Baba Basra is Daf Nun Ches Amud Aleph. It says, Rav Beno Havakamatzayin Ma'arta. Rav Beno was going around finding graves through Kabbalistic abilities. He would know where a grave is, and he would mark it with signs. Again, the Rishonim explain that the reason why he was doing this, so that no Kohen would stumble upon these graves. He would go to a field, find a grave in the field, and mark it. Kimatul Ma'arta da Avraham, when he eventually stumbled on Maras Machpelah, he got to the grave of Avram Avinu. Eshkechela Eliezer Eved Avram de Koi Baba. Kami Baba. So before he came into Maras Machpelah, he saw outside Maras Machpelah, he found Eliezer Eved Avram, Eliezer the servant of Avram. Say, Amar Le Maika Aved Avram. So Rabbanah says to Eliezer Eved Avram, what is Avraham doing right now? Amalei Gana Bekanfa de Sarah. He is lying in the grave of Sarah, the Kamaina liberation, and he's staring at Sarah adoringly. Again, whatever this means, this is all Kabbalistic. I don't know. Amalei Bena Koya Baba. So he says, Rabbanah says to Eliezer Eved Avram, tell Avram I'm here. Amalei Leil, made the other the Yetzib Hayal Maleka. So he says he entered and he started marking off the graves. It says though that when he get to Adam Rishon, who's buried in Maras Machpelah? Adam and Chava. When he got to Adam Rishon, a heavenly voice came out and it says, you looked at my creation, you can't look at me. Meaning Hashem is saying that Adam Rishon is so holy, it's such a reflection of Hashem because He made Adam Rishon. You can't look at Adam Rishon. It's not for human eyes. That's what the Gemara says. It's an unbelievable Gemara. It should be learned on its own, in depth. But what we see from this Gemara is that Rav Beno is marking off the Maras Machpelah so that Kohanim don't stumble on it. That's what the Rishonim says, the Rashbam says, the Ritva. So clearly he was concerned that Kohanim shouldn't stumble upon the Maras Machpelah, even though there are only Tzadikim buried there. So clearly, even Tzadikim do transmit Tumah. However, it should be known that the Rav Yaakov Emden, in his Gilyon Yaivitz on the Gemara there, he actually disagrees. He says, no, Tzadikim do not transmit Tumah. So why was he so interested in marking off the graves of the Maras Machpelah if Tzadikim do not transmit Tumah? Who cares where the Maras Machpelah is? He says, very simple. So that people can daven by it. We have to know Maras Machpelah so we can daven at the Avos. But the reason why Rabbeinu did it was not so that Kohanim don't stumble there, because Tzadikim do not transmit Tumah. The reason why he did this was so that people will know where to daven. So for the last 45 minutes, however long it's been, we've been discussing till now the sources back and forth. At the end of the day, the accepted halacha amongst Klal Yisrael is Tzadikim do transmit Tumah, and Kohanim do not go to the graves of a Tzadik under any circumstance. But let me just read you to end off a tshuva of Yaskel Avdi Cheleches Daf Kuf Tzadi Beis. This is from Rav Yaakov Rav Avadi Hadaya. He says he was asked this shaila: Can Kohen and Mutal Shtadich give it to Tzadikim? Is a Kohen allowed to daven at the graves of a Tzadik? He says, Hine Kfar Omen Al Zeharav Pischei Tshuva. The Pischei Tshuva was already asked by this. And he brings down from the Bati Kahuna that the tzaddikim that go to the graves, the Kohanim that go to the graves of the tzaddikim, is a mistake. And he summarizes. You look in that tshuva, and he says that the accepted Harelach de'ein makam lahater. There is no room to be lenient. Ve'ela hakayanim shenichnasim ein lahem mamash yismachu. Those that Kohanim that daven at the graves of tzaddikim have no halachic basis. That's what Rav Adaya says. There is a discussion as to how you daven there. Bez Hashem, that'll be probably a share in its own right. Again, hopefully we shouldn't need these shilas. Mashiach will be able to come. We'll be able to talk to the Avis directly. All questions can be sent to avizakatinsky@gmail.com, avizakautinsky@gmail.com.